I think we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for giving up your Friday afternoon to be here with us today. My name is Leila Wilmers. I'm a postdoctoral associate from the Department of Sociology, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our panel today on the theme of Nationalism Unsettled. This event is organised by the Nationalism and Identity Working Group, and it's hosted by the Institute for European Studies as part of the Einaudi Centre's Democratic Threats and Resilience Research Priority. It's co-sponsored also by Latin American and Caribbean Studies and the East Asia Programme. And I'd like to say just a few brief words about the Nationalism and Identity Working Group. I have the pleasure of being one of the instigators of this group, and I'm joined today by three others. Irina Troconis from Romance Studies, Mara Uedu from History, Ernesto Bassi also from History, and we also have with us Bianchini Munasinga from Anthropology, who's also a member of the group. And clearly we're a very interdisciplinary collective, as well as covering a span of regions that you don't normally see on a panel together, Russia, China, Venezuela, and the Caribbean. And it's a group that's been active since 2021, and is above all a space for exchange on a theme that we each come to from these different perspectives, and a space that enables us to re-examine our own lines of investigation from sometimes surprising new angles. And the changing manifestations of nationalism in the world today, as it interacts with new global challenges, make cross-disciplinary and comparative thinking in this field more important than ever. So I'm really grateful to have found such inspiring colleagues who share this sentiment and wanted to join this group. And I'd like to say a special word of thanks also to the Qualitative and Interpretive Research Institute and to the Society for the Humanities, both of which have provided grants to support the group's activities. And today, we're here to share with you perspectives from some of our individual research projects, and to open a wider discussion on the theme of nationalism unsettled. It's a theme that draws in many threads from our discussions over the past year and a half. And so often we hear that a political context is more about populism than nationalism, or that nationalism is not really relevant in certain contexts. But we have found that these questionable cases can actually tell us a lot about nationalism, precisely because they don't fit the mold. So today we're bringing to you a critical exploration of national imaginaries that disturb, defy, or deviate from mainstream nation-state narratives, demanding renewed consideration of the nature of nationalism. And we're lucky to have with us Begüm Adalet from the Department of Government, who's agreed to be our discussant. Thank you very much, Begüm. Each panelist is going to speak for roughly 10 minutes on their research, and then Begüm will have approximately 20 minutes to respond. And then we have the room until 5 o'clock, so we'll be opening up to discussion, Q&A, and we look forward to that as well. So without further ado, our first panelist is Ernesto Bassi, who's Associate Professor in the Department of History and also Director of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Over to you, Ernesto.
Well, thank you very much, Leila. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Begüm, for agreeing to comment on our papers. Thank you, Irina and Mara and Biranjini for very stimulating conversations as part of this group. As you will see in my brief presentation of what I'm doing, before joining this group, and I would actually not call Leila one of the instigators, but the instigator. My project was mostly about. I was more interested in political economy, economic visions of prosperity in an imperial setting. But I was reading a lot about these bureaucrats, right? Who also, there were bits and pieces here and there where they were expressing more implicit than explicitly a certain degree of affection for portion of land, right? So it was really nice to be reading that in my sources as I was participating in this in the discussions of the group. So today I'm going to introduce you to three of these characters: the governor, the viceroy, and the minister, right? And because my project centers Santa Marta, you can see the port of Santa Marta. I will show you a map of Santa Marta. Santa Marta is a city in northern Colombia. This is, I'm taking you back to the 1780s. So it's also interesting to think about something that looks like nationalism when nationalism doesn't exist, right? But the affection looks like nationalism, right? So, and I am trying to see Santa Marta in a larger Caribbean, Atlantic, and global setting. So the governor, the viceroy, and the minister, Santa Marta meant something for them, for some of them more than for others. So I'm going to very quickly read some reflections here, and I'll show you images of the portraits of the viceroy and the minister. There is not a portrait of the governor, and that also, I think, says a lot about an imperial bureaucracy, right? And about the rank, the position of certain bureaucrats in the imperial ladder. So on April 18, 1789, from the deck of the frigate Santa Leocadia, Antonio Caballero y Góngora saw the coast of New Granada for one last time. As the Santa Leocadia left the port of Cartagena and the contours of the coast began to fade in the horizon, the now former Archbishop Viceroy likely reflected on some of his accomplishments during his 10 years of residence in New Granada. A gaze to the southwest would have sufficed to remember his ambitious scheme for the colonization of the Darien. Turning his look to the southeast would have brought back memories of his efforts to organize the extraction of Brazil wood from Santa Marta. Thinking back to these efforts might have reminded him of some of his collaborators in New Granada, including one of his most trusted local officers, former governor of Santa Marta, Antonio Narváez y la Torre, the governor. Further reflection would have reminded him of Joseph de Galvez, the recently deceased minister of the Indies, who played a big role in his appointment first as Archbishop and then as Archbishop Viceroy of New Granada. The memory of Galvez would have directed Caballero y Góngora's thoughts forward to Spain and to Galvez's fellow minister, José Muñino, the Count of Florida Blanca, the minister of the title, who, as current Minister of State, was the top figure responsible for the ongoing empire-wide program to revitalize the Spanish Empire and restore its former grandeur. A program of reforms that Minister Florida Blanca referred to as a joyous revolution in the trade of Spain and its Indies. And so let me show you a couple of images. Yeah, no? No? So location of Santa Marta in the Caribbean, the location of Santa Marta in relation with Cartagena, which was the major port of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. The Viceroyalty of New Granada covers what is today Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. Detail of the province of Santa Marta, right? Lots of this territory is covered in Brazil wood. Lots of a big part of my work is about projects to extract, to export Brazil wood, out of which comes many shades of orange, red, and yellow. It was a dye. It's still a dye. It's no longer used. Antonio Narváez y la Torre, for whom there's not a portrait. One of his this is his sort of his CV, right? These are called relations of merits. All his services he's listing there, like 44, 42 years at the service of the crown as one of his loyal servants. That's a detailed description he wrote of the province of Santa Marta, arguing for the potential of Santa Marta, the big argument there, and this is a document that is central to my whole project. I go back to it. I think that at the end of the book I will have quoted every single line of that document, right? It's an argument for the very short summary is Santa Marta, despite having all the potential and to be the wealthiest territory of the crown in the world is currently in a deplorable state of misery. That's what those are sort of, I'm paraphrasing, but those are sort of his words. Archbishop Viceroy Caballero y Góngora, sort of in charge of materializing, of bringing the ministers Florida Blanca's joyous revolution to the ground in New Granada, right? So these two people are key. I think that's or actually I can read with them in the background. So Narvaez, the governor, Caballero y Góngora, the viceroy, not just viceroy, but Archbishop Viceroy, right? And Florida Blanca, who was not born the Count of Florida Blanca, right? Part of his ascending the imperial ladder was becoming Count. He was born Jose Moñino, later the Count of Florida Blanca. And I have like somewhat detailed biographies of them. I'm not going to bore you with the biographical details. So, Narvaez, Caballero y Góngora, and Florida Blanca devoted their lives to the service of the king. The three aspired to climb the imperial bureaucratic ladder. They all were, in different ways, patriotic. As committed imperial officers, they combined sense of duty, love of their patria, and loyalty to the Spanish monarch in the fulfillment of their positions. Their patriotism, expressed frequently in formulaic language stating their love and gratitude toward the king, was also evident in the actions they undertook to advance the wealth and grandeur of the Spanish Empire. Besides their common devotion to the Spanish monarch, however, their actions do not offer a clear picture of the geographic location and scope of their patriotism. If anything, their actions offer hints. While at different points in their lives, the three of them left their native homelands in pursuit of positions in different places, they all, sometimes voluntarily, other times forced, returned to their native lands. Both Narvaez and Caballero y Góngora died in the places where they were born, and Florida Blanca spent the last 15 years of his life in his native Murcia. While Narvaez's trajectory, despite a short stint in Spain and Northern Africa, was mostly local, spending most of his life and career in the provinces of Cartagena, Santa Marta, Riohacha, and Panama, his ambitions did never remain attached to his local patria. During the 1790s, while serving as governor of Panama, hopelessness and disenchantment emerged recurrently in both his personal and official correspondence. His implorations to be considered for positions in Callao, Guadalajara, and Guatemala, coupled with his determined rejection of a potential relocation to the Philippines, speak directly to his enduring ambition to climb the imperial bureaucratic ladder and to his desire to remain geographically and culturally close to his native land. His writings about plans for and deeds in Santa Marta reveal more than a sense of duty and the ambitions of a royal officer seeking to ascend the bureaucratic ladder. More than a duty, a challenge, and an opportunity, Narvaez Santa Marta was an affective site, a patria chica, or a place he could call home. To Caballero y Góngora, the viceroy, Santa Marta was something else. Through his close collaboration with Narvaez, he became well acquainted with Santa Marta, with its deplorable state of misery and with its immense potential. Yet, despite practically turning nearby Cartagena into his seat of government, Caballero y Góngora never set foot on Santa Marta. His trust in Narvaez led him to think of Santa Marta as a key site for the development of his plans for New Granada. In his endeavor to take advantage of the enormous wealth with which the immense liberality of the Almighty had endowed that precious portion of the Americas, those were his words, Caballero y Góngora saw Santa Marta as an important cog in the machine, but just a cog, nevertheless. Recollections of New Granada and of his work with Narvaez setting up the Brasilwood Estanco, royal monopoly, in Santa Marta, may have assaulted him after returning to his native Cordoba. His trajectory, nevertheless, demonstrates that Caballero y Góngora's Santa Marta and New Granada were mere duties and stepping stones, never homelands to adopt. From Florida Blanca's vantage point, this is the minister, it must have been difficult to even notice Santa Marta. As one of the oldest Spanish cities in the Americas, the name must have been known to educated Spaniards of Florida Blanca's status. Publications such as Antonio Julián's La Perla de América and the reports of Narvaez and his successor Joseph Astigarraga may have reached the busy minister. The name certainly appeared in a few of the documents Florida Blanca prepared for or reviewed before the king's signature. Yet, from his location in Madrid's court, Santa Marta was merely one of nearly 100 provinces that could contribute to his joyous revolution. This meant that despite the argument of dutiful officers such as Narváez and Caballero y Góngora, Florida Blanca, concerned as he was with the revitalization of the whole empire, had no problem letting an individual province continue to lie in appalling misery. The minister's joyous revolution did not require the prosperity of Santa Marta. While his patriotism covered the whole empire, it could easily let the distant Santa Marta, despite its alleged immense potential, fall through the cracks. Narváez, Caballero y Góngora, and Florida Blanca were all patriotic. What their patria was and where it was located was not always clear. Their lives and trajectories help us understand patria and patriotism as malleable concepts, as moving targets, expanding and contracting, and even jumping from one location to another. Their trajectories make it clear that while native land and homeland can coincide, it is also possible for someone to adopt a new patria, to find a homeland in a non-native land. Moreover, while it is common to think of patria or homeland as a reduced geographical space, the patria chica, the tale of these three patriots shows that affection and attachment, as the case of Florida Blanca makes evident, can also be associated with the larger imperial motherland. Their trajectories ultimately offer a historical example of the dictum, or the cliché, that home is where the heart is. Where the hearts of those whose lives we study were and how these affections move from one place to another is not always evident. While it seems clear that at least an important portion of Narváez's heart was in Santa Marta, the place of the province in the hearts of Caballero y Góngora and Florida Blanca was nowhere to be found. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. So our next speaker is Mara Yoidu, who is assistant professor in the Department of History. I don't know. Should we press it on? Yeah.
Oops.
No?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But I need to go back. Okay. Good. Thank you so much for coming first. I really need to express my deepest gratitude to our captain, because without her, basically, it would not have been this group in the first place, and especially for my project. And I'll explain in 1 minute that I got a bunch of questions, some empirical data, etc., but everything was just out there. I actually didn't know how to make sense of them, and the current framework of the book really grew up in this group through this reading of books that were not in my comfort zone, basically. And also I'm very grateful to Begüm for agreeing to comment, to be the commentator. And I'm so sorry, because you can see, like, at this moment, I'm trying to dismantle this chapter and put it together after cutting off a bunch of things and adding a new section. So it looks terrible, and I don't know how much torture you endure even by reading it. But anyway, I will discuss mostly the framework of the book and how this chapter fit into the book. And this book is at this phase that is sort of like 80 or 70% there. That it's your comments will really sort of decide the fate of the book, which I hopefully can submit, the manuscript can be submitted in 24, early 25. So this is a book on a single term. That term is not nation, but an indigenous term that is understood to represent a nation, but in Chinese history, it represented something else. So the title of the book is called China from a Nationless State to a Nation Defined by State, and it's around this, this character on the right corner. So it's called Guo. So it's so why where the project started in the first place? Because I grew up in China, and I went through the whole so-called patriotic education as every other Chinese national who are educated in China go through. And I was taught basically like love your country, etc., from childhood. But when I came here, and I look at all those like newspaper articles, etc. They're talking about rising Chinese nationalism. But what they talk about, I often disagree. I don't think it's a kind of nationalism. It's more like state patriotism. And they think it's nationalism. And we were taught it was nationalism. But it seems that all the loyalty of the Chinese citizens are supposed to be directed toward the state. But in the Western context, the state is not the nation, right? It's sort of like these two words are often used interchangeably, occasionally, but there are some sort of conceptual distinction. So that really made me think, what's going on here. So this project is okay. Yeah, and often in the translation, either in popular writing or just in academic writing, because this word, the guo, means simultaneously nation state, country, regime. There are a lot of meanings that it comes together at the same time in each word. But for each word, it just has some, in some words, the nation part like will be more heavily. For some words, this is one component, right, of a lot of like these words. And in some words, nation part will be more heavily. In some parts, it's like the state part or regime part will be more heavily. But in any of these cases, basically it still has different meanings at the same time. For example, when that forces scholars to translate. So when you read English scholarship on Chinese nation, Chinese nationalism, is a mediated reading of something that actually probably means different things in Chinese. For example, when the national essence or national treasure is discussed, right? It means guo essence, guo treasure, right? It's very nation, we can say. But then also the state council or the state-owned company, also the same word, it's basically guo-owned company or guo council, right? And then there are the founding of the People's Republic of China, the founding of the regime. It's also called founding of the guo. So everything sort of like conflicted together in the Chinese language, right? So my book is really to trace what's going on here. So I'm reading a pre-modern concept into the modern era rather than reading modern notion guo back into the past. This book explores how China and Chinese nationalism have been shaped by the multifaceted concept guo, a word for dynastic state in classical Chinese. This term came to be used for the modern nation state since the 19th century through translation of international law and the introduction of nationalism to China as mediated by Chinese overseas and transnational intellectuals. But guo's lingering meaning of regime or political dynasty as broadly defined continued to undermine both the ethnic and the civic aspects of nation building in China's Qing to Republic transition. The strong connotation of the state over the people and the regime above institutions of governance within the triple phase guo or nation-state regime fully revived after 1949, influencing class politics under Mao Zedong and the rising state patriotism in contemporary China. So these are the structure. You can see it's really a long-duration project that starts from the analysis of image of so-called paragon of patriotism or loyalty in China, USA, from the medieval China to the contemporary, through looking at the image of this person to look at the change of meaning of this word, guo, right? And then from the second chapter onward, there's in chronological order. Chapter 2 discuss how the word for dynastic state came to be used to represent the nation state through translation of international law. And through this process, and also, of course, the Qing dynasty's diplomatic engagement with foreign powers, the China gained this trans-dynastic meaning. So it was no longer this dynasty versus that dynasty, because all those dynasties were also referred to as whatever, guo, right? So they started to look at, oh, China was a trans-dynastic entity. And then the third one looks at how both ethno-nationalism and civic nationalism was introduced to China via overseas Chinese and also Chinese intellectuals, mostly in Japan. So for, in nationalism studies, what we often say, oh, ethno-nationalism versus civic nationalism. But for China, it was the same process because it was the same group of people introduced these formulas to China. during this period at the turn of the 20th century. And chapter 4 was using the national flag anthem and to of the Republic of China as a kind of lens to look at how different versions of national anthems in Chinese history reflected different regimes' aspiration, right? And I want to show that, you know, the Republican period between 1912 and 1949 was an exception, that they thought about the nation, whatever, you know, however it was defined, it could be an ethnic nation or civic nation, whatever, about China. And in both the teen and post 1949, it was mostly about the regime that was on the national flag anthem. And this chapter, the chapter I submitted to Begüm, was the national song, national flag chapter that's called Revolutionizing the Nation, Class Politics Under Mao Zedong. It looks like looks at looks at different chapter. I will go into details now on what this chapter is about. Different national flags. And how that represented. You can see the first one was the Qing national flag. That was pretty much the royal house, and it was in line with the Qing's understanding. At least a lingering understanding, even at the end, that the Great Qing state was different from previous dynasties and later regimes, etc. So it was, you know, sort of, it was kind of about China, etc. Right? If that makes sense. And the second and third were the early republic and nationalist flags for China. The second one was obvious. It was a nation defined ethnically, right? It's a nation defined by the unity of 5 ethnic groups, 5 major ethnic groups. And the third one was a nationalist flag that was used to represent China from 1928 to 1949 in mainland China, still today in Taiwan. So this is, it has some similarity with the communist flag. You can see this is the party flag of the party then in power, and this was the whole nation, right? The party defines the nation, but in its heart and core, it's actually very, we can see almost like a colonial project, that there is, let me go back to this. In the third chapter, I will discuss how this, the evolution of this flag, it was pretty much inspired almost like by the American flag, and it was developed not in China, actually in Southeast Asia, in the overseas community. And the official interpretation of the flag was also very much, you can see the color is very much like French flag and American flag, and interpretation was very much the same as liberty, equality, fraternity. And of course, there were other influence from the Japanese flag. You can see here it's very similar. But you can see there were some sort of always lingering notion that the regime defines the nation. But how the nation was defined was still very much, at least the leaders try to bring that in line with some sort of like so-called universal value. And then this is the Chinese Communist flag. And basically the first section, through a movie, I'm talking about what's going on with this design. So in 1949, there was a call for proposal to the new national flag, so-called national flag, or we can translate it as regime flag because it's the same word in Chinese. And there was a guy who proposed this, and his interpretation of the flag was, so this is the Chinese Communist Party, and the leading class basically means the working class, etc. But these 4 represent a lot of things that were very much like nation, for example, 4,000 years, 400 million people, etc. So a lot of like liberty, independence, or something like that. A lot of like, we can say like ethno-civic nationalism. And then, but then it was selected, and Mao Zedong interpreted it differently. So basically the party interpreted it to represent the nature of the regime. He said, this is the Chinese Communist Party. These were the constituencies of the nation. That was the workers, peasants, patriotic bourgeoisie, and petty bourgeoisie. So it was like what they regard as part of the people. And they also remade a memory. Basically, this guy, if you look at the original sources, you know, he proposed, oh, it represents so many different things. But then if you interview him now, he will say, yes, it's what's perfectly in line with Mao Zedong's interpretation of the nation was composed of different classes, right? And then the second in this current draft, this is two sections, but basically I'm using this movie, how Mao Zedong was using this movie on the Qingdan. So it was a 1948 movie that portrayed a reform in the late Qing dynasty. It's a constitutional, so-called bourgeois reform. It failed, but in 1948, there was a movie producer produced something basically to say, basic call for patriotism, right? And the movie producer was actually a left-wing supporter of the Chinese Communist Party, but Mao Zedong really didn't like this movie, and during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, he used this movie to attack the then head of state Liu Shaoqi. And he said this movie was totally treacherous, and Liu Shaoqi, because he supported this movie, it means he was a traitor. So his logic, I'm looking at this, his logic of attacking this movie was the protagonist of this movie, the Guangxu Emperor, right? Actually, according to the law at the time, he was a sovereign, right? But then he was a traitor because he aimed to build a capitalist state. And China, it would never succeed. And that means he was a traitor of the socialist ancestral country and Mao Zedong. So you can see the logic, it seems to be weird because he didn't even know that, like he died in 1910, but it was his logic. And Liu Shaoqi, Mao Zedong said, Liu Shaoqi imagined as head of state, he was that emperor. So he also, as a capitalist ruler, he betrayed the nation, 叛国, right? Because he betrayed the communist socialist nation under the leadership of Mao Zedong. So the logic seems to be twisted, but there was sort of like, but then if we understand how the Chinese Communist Party defined the Chinese nation, it sort of kind of made sense because, the Chinese Communist Party at its high socialist period, it wasn't talking about Chinese long history, 5,000 years, anything like that, right? China was defined by the regime, and China was defined by the constituencies of the nation. So, and then that's the third, this is third, this is going to be the third section that I will look at, compare the 1946 nationalist constitution to the People's Republic of China, the constitution. There were several versions to look at why this sort of odd understanding of the country sort of made sense in this period, because we think it's national sovereignty, and the People's Republic of China is constitution also say that sovereignty belongs to the people, but the people is not the people. So the people is not the people. So it's not every Chinese citizen was a people. That we go back to so it's also a translation issue. So if you look at the 1946 constitution, that is actually in effect in Taiwan today. Taiwan's democracy is based on, built on that constitution. In the constitution, they made it very clear that citizens are the people, right? They could be called 国民 or 人民 or 公民, but it's the same thing. And the country belongs to the people. So it's the familiar language we all understand as nationalism. This is how people and citizens, etc., were defined in Chinese constitutions until the latest one that is in effect now. It's always been like that. So the country or the sovereign word, the people, this word, the people, 人民, that's a special term, right? They enjoy democracy. And the rise, the 人民 plus those enemy who were also Chinese citizens, they were the Chinese nationals. So the sovereignty belonged to this group. It didn't belong to all of this. And Mao Zedong also made it clear before 1949. So they really had a coherent logic that 人民, the definition of the people, also changed over time. Now we have this form, right? He said, some people accuse us to be dictators. Dictatorship is good. That's what he said. Because the people, then enjoy the democracy, right? And dictatorship was against the enemy. So, and he also said it can change. Now we have these 4 revolutionary groups, and in the future it could change. For example, during the Cultural Revolution, it already changed. The capitalists were no longer part of the people, right? It can change at any time because anybody who disagrees with them could be part of the enemy. So it's perfectly coherent. And I would also compare the constitution of North Korea and South Korea to look at we often laugh at it, how, North Korea could be a democratic people's republic. But they have their logic, because if you disagree, you're not part of the people. So people always enjoy democracy. So the constitution actually works. It determines whether a regime could transform itself into a democracy without having to overthrow the whole thing. Right. And then the last chapter would be looking at the foreigners who were regarded as the comrades within, foreigners who were part of working class and who supported the regime could be part of the cause, while some of the Chinese nationals were not part of the cause. So that's this chapter. And then it lasts to the last one is the contemporary chapter, loving the country is loving the regime, patriotism in contemporary China. And, of course, I will not go into that, but I just want to really look at one phrase that Xi Jinping recently came up with, but really in response to a lot of Mao Zedong's, poems, etc. Is that 不忘初心, don't forget your original cause. And he also said people are the mountains and rivers. These were really like impure languages, and it wasn't. In recent years, he really emphasized in many occasions that the Chinese Communist Party conquered the mountains and rivers, and people are the mountains and rivers, right? But right here, but it's not just him, and Mao Zedong himself said that. So he described China as mountains and rivers that, all those great heroes wanted to take over it. So I want to explain the nature, why it goes back to so-called revolutionizing, right? Revolution is original meaning, really, I guess it's a kind of full circle, right? So the nature of the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Republic of China, in Mao Zedong's own word, is Marx plus the founding emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. He said, we need the founding emperor of impure China 2,000 years ago, Qin Shi emperor, the first emperor of China. We also need Marx. So it was a combination of this idealist goal plus a lot of ruling mechanism and notion, including the notion of sovereignty and nation inherited from the imperial times. It was a revolution in the sense that it discarded the colonial influence of ethno civic nationalism of the Republic period, returned to an earlier notion of the dynastic state. Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. And now we have Irina Trokonis from the Department of Advanced Studies. Maybe we do.
Maybe we don't.
Maybe you're able to.
Oh, yeah, I'm good.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you everyone for being here. I know it's Friday. I know there's a lot going on. But like my colleagues, I also want to express my gratitude to Leila, without whom we literally wouldn't be here. Or maybe we'll be here, we'll be very confused. So she has been amazing. My colleagues have been amazing. Working on a research group that is this interdisciplinary really pushes you outside of your comfort zone. Because as you're gonna see in like 5 seconds, I work on art and visual culture. So definitely not history or sociology, but I have learned so much being in conversation with you. And now, of course, with Begüm, who I very much admire. And I think we're very, very lucky to have you. So I don't have the eloquence or the passion of my colleagues about this project because it's really just starting. So bear with me with that. And I'm gonna be reading. So hopefully, yeah, you can see the resonances between this, which is gonna ask you to think about the idea of the nation in the context of the diaspora, and specifically in the context of the Venezuelan diaspora. So with that, the piece that I'll be discussing today, titled Crisálida. Where am I pointing? Oh, there we go. Crisálida, or Chrysalis, and created by Venezuelan artist Pepe Lopez, is part of the corpus of my second book, tentatively titled Translucency, Memory, Materiality, and Loss in the Venezuelan Diaspora. In it, I will analyze works of art and fiction, and you can see some of them on the screen, that engage materially, aesthetically, and conceptually with a notion of translucency that I am proposing as a way of seeing a diasporic gaze that only partially accesses that which is its object, but also as a form of materiality that creates temporalities that don't fall into restorative nostalgia and understandings of national identity that don't rely on operations of identification, but rather on recognition, implication, resonance, and contagion. I argue that thinking about the different dimensions of translucency and how it appears in each of these works allows us to identify, among other things, the operations and the effects of the state's bureaucratic violence, question the boundaries that have historically defined the contours of national identity and national belonging, and insert Venezuela in debates about diaspora, but also in theoretical debates around the memory, eco-criticism, and practices of community making and care. Today, I will share with you some very preliminary thoughts on the ways translucency operates when it comes to Crisálida, an exhibition that took place in Caracas first in 2017 and then in London in 2018. Made up of over 200 objects that belong to Lopez, his family, his friends, or his acquaintances, and which he carefully wrapped in plastic, Crisálida has been called the biggest, most convincing, and most significant monument to have ever been made in honor of the Venezuelan diaspora. In fact, images of the exhibition are often featured on the cover of anthologies and poetry books, and Crisálida has been the subject of several influential academic articles. The attention the exhibition has received, and most importantly, the way it seems to resonate with how the Venezuelan diaspora is felt both in Venezuela and outside, has to do, I believe, with the fact that it isn't a war photography, as Lopez himself insists. In it, we don't see portraits of the Venezuelans who risk their lives every day crossing the Darien Gap or traveling by foot to other Latin American countries. There is no sensationalism, no explicit representation of the horror of displacement. There is also no one single autobiographical narrative. The objects in the installation belong to Lopez, and Lopez himself is inside of it, as you're going to see soon, but Crisálida isn't about him, or rather isn't just about him. As one encounters one of the many objects, including a paella pan, or a car, or a trash can, one certainly can sense the presence of the memories he attached to them, protected by the plastic. However, I argue one also encounters a gap that is both the shape of an absence that is felt individually and collectively, and an invitation, a hand reaching out to bring spectators into the chrysalis. Thus, Crisálida is not one diasporic narrative distilled into one single diasporic image. The installation stages an act of storytelling that is tied to the decisions anybody who has to leave their country has to make regarding the things that create the material world where we build ourselves an identity and a home. Crisálida, then, is about being with the things that is not limited to Lopez and that demands a multi-temporal gaze that resists horizontality. In Crisálida, there is no oscillation, I think, between a before and an after. Instead, there is an overlap of time periods that doesn't produce clear outcomes, which Crisálida typically don't do, but a slow and partially veiled temporal suspension where mourning meets resistance and hope. In producing this overlap, Crisálida deviates from representations that come from literature, but also from journalism, that in their efforts to represent various dimensions of the Venezuelan diaspora, privilege clarity and strive to capture the right colors of the Venezuela of before, the exact shape of ruins, or the precise sounds of the loss and pain that define the millions that leave the country every day and that have done so for the past decade. In Crisálida, clarity is replaced with translucency, a form of partial visibility produced by the layers of plastic in which the objects are wrapped, and the imagined nation is replaced with a collective and fearless reimagining of the home that is activated by being in a space populated by objects that are both familiar and unfamiliar, foreign and recognizable, static and on the move. This liminality is the result of Lopez's decision to wrap the objects in plastic rather than presenting them as exposed or raw, their identity and their utility explicit and indisputable. Initially, his plan was to have the objects wrapped in the airport because there people write suitcases to prevent them from being open in the trip. But when he brought the objects, especially one that you're going to see now, which is the bust of Simón Bolívar, this is Venezuela's liberator, blonde, when he brought them, the packer that he had hired said that he wasn't going to wrap them up. And then the military came to him and asked him why he was there, if he wasn't traveling, why did he have that bust of Bolívar, and to see his identity documents. So after that, he was like, nope, I'm going to go wrap them myself, which meant he wrapped not just a trash can, but his actual car and motorcycle and bed and a bunch of other things, right? So there's lots to say about this, and Begüm actually had to read a lot of these ideas, but today I want to focus specifically on this episode of Crisálida because it allows us to see the ways in which among the loss, the pain, and the hope that the exhibition captures, there is also an act of defiance. Crisálida, I argue, represents a challenge to the official discourses articulated and mobilized by a state that aims to shape and contain a nation and its identity so that state power can operate more easily. For the last 20 years in Venezuela, those discourses have relied on the irreconcilable binaries pro-government opposition. Before, they had relied on the compulsive collective identification with and cult of Simón Bolívar, Venezuela's liberator, or with oil, which is Venezuela's natural body. López's Crisálida shatters them all. What does it mean to be Venezuelan in the context of this installation? The answer is an eclectic constellation where Bolívar, blonde, and thus not the Bolívar that we have always known, appears next to a trash can, a photo album that can't be opened, a globe, a stained mattress, and a borrowed curtain pole. Things from the nation, about the nation, and indifferent to the nation. In other words, a free field of identificatory possibilities that throws us into complete identificatory chaos. Individually, Oblong Simón Bolívar unsettles the iconography of the hero in which the state has always grounded its legitimacy and its authority. As a group, the things of Crisálida that seem both in harmony and at odds with each other open up multiple spaces of identification, recognition, misrecognition, and indifference. National identity appears fluid and irreverent. Bolívar next to a trash can might mean nothing, or the proximity between the two might trigger associations that ultimately lead us to look elsewhere, beyond Bolívar, to redefine the reference that dictate who we are as Venezuelans. It can certainly be argued that Venezuelan identity and national identity in general has always been like this: beers and a photo album and a trash can next to a revered national icon. However, I would argue that something else, something magical and perhaps new, happens when this eclectic constellation reveals itself in the moment that Crisálida marks, which is the moment before departure, where the citizen, soon-to-be migrant, has to take note of all the things that made up their life and slowly said goodbye to them. In that moment, the things come alive, and all the possibilities that they contain, social, historical, and political, acquire a value that is hard to dismiss precisely because we know that each of them will be missed, regardless of how useful or how useless we thought they were before we have to leave them behind. The plastic is a confirmation of that feeling. Wrapping up a trash can in a plastic, protecting it from dust and harm, turns a trash can into something worth noting and caring for, something of value that is tied somehow to who we have always been. But the plastic also alludes to one of the other pillars that has historically grounded Venezuelan identity, and that the migration crisis has forced us to revisit and call into question, which is oil. In this form, as plastic, oil appears as something that can provide protection, which is accurate to the extent that, however horrifying Venezuela's crisis has been, the country's seemingly infinite oil reserves have provided a sort of cushion and the hope that in the future they could help the country recover from its current condition. However, when we see López wrapping himself up in plastic during the performance that accompanied the exhibitions, care slowly transforms into potentially lethal violence. For if López succeeds, if he wraps himself up completely in plastic, he will suffocate, which he doesn't, by the way, he lives. López's performance is an invitation to think about Crisálida in material terms, rather than just symbolic ones. What is the potential harm, the hidden violence of the familiar objects and discourses that we turn to for comfort in moments of crisis? What is the protective bubble we surround ourselves with made of? In light of the ongoing global debate regarding oil and renewable energy sources and the imperative to think about the future in more ecological terms, these questions that Crisálida asks are notably urgent. They remind us of a global vulnerability that, as the performance insists, is not disconnected from the vulnerability of the Venezuelan migrant, whom ideologies, political agendas, widespread indifference, racism, and xenophobia have turned, like the plastic film threatens to do to López, into an object, a piece in a game that will never really be about them and in which they will always come out losing. The plastic in Crisálida thus has a double function. On one hand, it protects López's things, and in doing so, fuels the feelings of hope, amid the pain and the loss of the Venezuelan diaspora. On the other, and as it appears in López's performance, It draws our attention to a multi-directional violence that literally permeates the entire exhibition and forces us to think about bodies and not just things, Venezuelan and not, migrating and not, about what harms them and about what protects them. In the case of Venezuelan migrants, these questions are left unanswered, and so they linger for as long as we linger amid the objects of Lopez's Crisálida, ensuring that the migrating body that those more than 200 things speak about becomes unbearably present, impossible to ignore, and worthy of care even in their absence. So to conclude, Crisálida asks us to reflect on what it means to be part of a national community and to question generously and fearlessly the identities and security that we so comfortably presume. The things in a turn Crisálida into what maybe Levi-Lipis calls, and I quote, a hybrid space of belonging, a place that integrates both the tendency of those in diaspora to look backward, creating ties to a distant place through memories, as well as the liberatory powers of diaspora being freed from a monolithic connection to a single place. This sense of belonging is not only about migrants themselves, where they belong to once and where they're going to belong to next. It's also about anyone who encounters the installation and recognizes something about themselves in its eclectic constellation of vibrant things, in the somewhat familiar curtain pole, somewhat familiar cake platter, somewhat familiar curtain road. Recognition rather than identification, where identification, I believe, ends the conversation. Recognition in the context of Crisálida opens up a path for us to contemplate the possibility of a shared vulnerability and the responsibilities that derive from understanding care the way Eliza Nissenbaum thinks of it, as paying attention to a person's materiality. For Nissenbaum, this means paying attention to the materiality of their body, but I would argue that care is also paying attention to the materiality of a person's life, to all the things, big and small, useful and useless, that shape their identity and their home. In Crisálida, paying attention to these things creates the sort of resonances and fleeting moments of recognition that make us feel like we too belong there among all the chrysalises, keeping company and bearing witness to the absence of those who had no choice but to leave. Crisálida thus goes beyond telling one diasporic story, Lopez says, from a single point of view. It builds a space for a community in the making that supports the possibility of new subjectivities and a new ethics of care that are discentered from the obligation we feel toward those who are exactly like us, and instead are grounded in a fluid togetherness informed by the feelings of intimacy with a familiar stranger that we experience as we enter and become part, however fleetingly, of the installation's ever-expanded network of translucent and vibrant things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm going to give the final paper before we move on to Begüm. Thank you. So my paper is drawn from a chapter from the book I'm writing with the working title Ambivalent Nationhood, Homelands, People, the State and Belonging in Putin's Russia. And the book as a whole looks at how tensions that exist within nationalism are brought to life and negotiated in narratives of belonging in Russia. And today I'm going to talk about bottom-up engagement with the myth of national resilience specifically. So what do I mean by a myth of national resilience? In response to a zeitgeist of endemic precarity, discourses of resilience have mushroomed in spheres as wide-ranging as psychology, environmental conservation, economics and security policy. And the philologist Ana Fraile Marcos notes that across these fields, resilience connotes a capacity to withstand adversity, to endure by being flexible, and to adapt to conditions of crisis. And scholars of nation building have observed increasing references to national resilience in political discourse. And in some cases, resilience becomes a defining theme of national memory and national myth. Myths of national resilience render trauma in a nation's history as fundamental to its identity, similarly to myths of national victimhood. However, rather than focusing on a nation's passive suffering and on grievances against perpetrators, the concept of national resilience directs attention instead to the nation's agentic capacity to withstand future strife. And in doing so, critics have noted it channels a neoliberal approach to problem solving, shifting responsibility to the individual for coping with crises that are caused by systemic and structural factors. And in this way, the myth can be exploited, not only to deflect scrutiny of illiberal policies, but also to detract attention from the state's failure to protect its citizens. So in the Russian case, in 2020, the state-owned Russian Public Opinion Research Center conducted a poll on the Russian character. 70% of respondents responded yes to the question, is there a Russian character? And of these 70%, the 70% were then asked the question, in your opinion, which positive traits are most characteristic of the Russian national character? And the results were grouped thematically. And the second and third most frequent groupings were themes that really connect to the broader theme of resilience. So the second most frequent grouping was courage, perseverance, endurance, and determination, with 23% of respondents naming these. And the third was sufferance, reliability, and adaptability at 18%. So these results suggest that notions of national resilience resonate strongly in Russia. However, national resilience is linked to two diverging myths of collective historical victimhood. So there isn't necessarily a single meaning that this is attributed to. So one of the myths is that that may be more familiar to you, that of Russia's historical victimization by the West. And the idea of the West as Russia's other took off in the early 19th century, but it was really Stalin who developed the narrative of a repeating victimhood and resilience against the West. And he used it to frame the USSR's catastrophic losses in the Second World War and then their ultimate victory. And this myth brings together the Russian nation and state in a condition of perpetual existential defense. Putin, of course, has increasingly lent on this in explaining Russia's foreign relations since the annexation of Crimea, and now in justifying his war of aggression in Ukraine. But less discussed in debate on contemporary Russia is an alternative interpretation of Russia's resilience that positions the Russian nation at odds with the state. And like the idea of the West as Russia's other, this idea originates in the 19th century. Slavophile intellectuals saw authentic peasant culture as repressed by the Tsars since Peter the Great's westernizing reforms 200 years earlier. And this myth of victimhood at the hands of the state has resurfaced periodically in the narratives of leaders following overhauls of the Russian state, including Lenin and later Yeltsin, and of activists opposed to the state, both in Soviet times and in the present day. So given the salience of the myth of national resilience in Russia and its contradictory historical interpretations, how is it used and navigated by ordinary people? And what can this tell us about the role of discourses of resilience in nation building? So the findings I'm going to present come from fieldwork I conducted in 2017 to 18 in two Russian cities, Kazan and Yekaterinburg. And I draw on semi-structured interviews with 68 residents aged from 18 to 90. So dominant across a majority of the narratives was an emphasis on the actions of coping with the mundane hardships of everyday precarity, rather than on macro-level responses to geopolitical threats. And despite residing in a modern city, interviewees tended to connect the Russian character to a capacity to address basic needs of in a subsistent context, basic survival needs. And many interviewees described this national quality with a fond reference to simpler times and lifestyles than they currently experienced. In their narratives, importantly, the state was often implicitly absent. So a quote from one of the, respondents. So evidently, self-sufficiency can be a source of national pride, as in this example. And some people also reported finding solace in the simple practices of a traditional rural way of life, spending leisure time in the countryside, for example. But these feelings do not necessarily mean opposition to the state. They may even detract attention from its failings. However, they also don't support a statist vision of the nation. Rather, the focus on individual agency in a context of absent structural support suggests a view of the Russian people as unneeding of the state. And the emotions expressed in connection with national resilience illustrate the ambivalent engagement that the myth can generate among the public. Some interviewees highlighted that national resilience comes with a long-term suffering that other nations are spared. And so for Nina, embracing resilience is part of an attachment to Russia that she feels in spite of the nation's inability to overcome its challenges. Resilience can thus take on the meaning of a collective trait that cannot be escaped, or even a duty. And such narratives open questions about the value of resilience as a national quality, expressed sometimes with irony. Here's another quote. And this has conflicting implications, of course, for nation building. On the one hand, such narratives affirm the nation state as containing a people with a unique shared experience and character, and belief in national resilience can fuel a fatalist complacency that served the Kremlin's purposes. On the other hand, the sense of the nation state as a place of persistently desperate conditions necessitating resilience casts shadows over its status as a positive target for belonging. And a few interviewees expressed openly critical narratives, critical of the state, in which national resilience was framed more directly as a response to the perennial violence of the state. And you can imagine, this is 2017 to 18, it would be very difficult to capture these narratives now. But here's an example. So here, the everyday agency of survival practices is depicted as isolating and futile, rather than unifying and constructive. And responsibility for this obliged resilience is attributed to the state. Such grievances, I think, can be described as a resilience fatigue. And the political theorist Julian Reed advocates for promoting a capacity to imagine that exceeds the straitjacket of resilience. And in this vein, some interviewees express efforts to extend their thinking about the nation. So Sonia here seeks to banish constraints on the national future imposed by a need to deal with the past. And at the same time, the vision she depicts is of a freedom from burden, a burden that's conceived in opposition to past traumas. So the post-resilience nation remains an undefined fantasy with a nebulous path to fulfillment. And to conclude, the myth of national resilience finds resonance in vernacular conceptions of the Russian nation. However, the centering of lived experience can leave the state marginal in the story of the nation's ongoing survival. There's currently debate among external analysts over Russia's future, and in the context of this, these findings highlight that the Russian national imaginary has cultural threads that can survive disillusionment with the state. They also open questions about the effects of political discourses of national resilience more broadly, and the neoliberal logic of resilience discourse in creating expectations of the individual may not always serve the interests of nation builders. Thank you.
I'll start. Thank you. I'll start by thanking you all for coming, and thank you especially to Leila for organizing this and inviting me, and thank you to the other panelists for sharing their wonderful work with me. So together, these papers go beyond the well-known formulation of the nation as a political community that's imagined, and they show how it's also experienced, felt, and materialized in a variety of aesthetic, bureaucratic, and documentary forms. And they take us to a diverse range of settings, both historically and geographically. They treat the nation not as primordial, timeless, static, singular, or predetermined in its scope and location, but instead show how it's malleable and multidimensional in its intensity, contours, and orientations. The papers show how the nation's various subjects and objects of belonging shift, changing in what, where, and when they attach to and wrap around, to use Irina's language. And in doing so, the papers truly unsettle, disturb, destabilize the meaning, not only of the nation, but also related concepts like patriotism, diaspora, exile, and so forth, showing how each of these fraught terms have messy histories and uncertain futures. And I learned so much from reading the papers, both individually and collectively. And I was also especially struck by how each addressed the various temporalities, affects, and materials of nationalism. So I'll organize my comments around these three terms. So first on temporality, each paper shows how belonging to a nation, being in transit between different nations, the self-presentation or the top-down creation of patriotic subjects, all entail ways of summoning up the past, inhabiting the present, and dreaming up new futures. But the papers call into question the nation's self-proclaimed movement through empty homogeneous time. They disrupt linear transitions between distinct moments of history, and instead they present something more like a palimpsest with different temporal orientations associated with the nation layered on top of one another. In Mara's paper, this means that, quote, a former sovereign of China could be retrospectively denounced as a national traitor for his presumed pursuit of a capitalist future for a socialist China. For Leila's interlocutors, the claim of we have always been resilient can take different and sometimes overlapping historical reference. For Ernesto's imperial bureaucrats, their attempts to engineer new futures are both predicated on experiences of the past, but also often derailed by revolutionary ruptures of the present moment. And in Irina's reading of Pepe Lopez's work, the time frame of liminality goes beyond, quote, revisiting the past and imagining the future, unsettling the clarity with which some accounts of diaspora represent clear-cut divisions between the before, after, and during of upheaval. This straightforward periodization of the nation is upended perhaps most clearly in Irina's paper, which proposes the aesthetic and political concept of translucency. This incredibly generative concept comes from that plastic wraparound that illuminates and radiates the objects in Lopez's work, but it goes beyond the exhibit to shed light on categories of nostalgia and memory more broadly. As I understand it, this notion deflects the clarity with which nationalism insists on a linear narrative for itself, and in foregrounding liminality instead of a static concept of past glory or future aspiration for the nation, the plastic obscures and counteracts the penetrating gaze of the nation state, which insists always on legibility, clarity, and certitude. So one question I have for Irina would be, to what extent is this moment of translucency peculiar to the diasporic moment of decision-making in Venezuela, or is it possibly a perennial element of the messy in-betweenness and uncertainty and liminality that is so formative of all nations, but which official narratives and representations tried their best to conceal and suppress? This question of how much the temporal and conceptual categories of the papers might travel also occurred to me in reading Leila's account of the myth of national resilience in Russia. One of the striking parts of the paper is how resilience appears against different historical reference, different periods of despotic rule within the Russian state or against the incursion of Western enemies. And the paper does a really wonderful job of presenting a bottom-up account of this resilience, and listening carefully to how the respondents describe their experiences and understanding of the term. And as Leila points out, both adoptions of resilience seem to map onto how the concept is taken up in secondary literatures, in centering national memory and the traumatic past in defining the nation, and so adopting a backward-looking class. This myth of resilience can curtail the emancipatory potential of moving forward, prioritizing only the chance for survival and existence in a perpetually present moment of precarity. Or alternatively, in identifying the quote-unquote Western enemies as danger, the future is presented as carrying uncertainty and constant risk of extermination. But in this scenario, too, the past is a resource to be sheltered and preserved at all costs. So what I want to ask Leila is, and what doesn't really come through very clearly in the paper, do you agree with these depictions of resilience that appear in the secondary literature? How well do they map onto how your interviewers describe their own experiences? Are the two diverging myths of resilience against the oppressive state internally and against external enemies, to what extent are these at odds or in tension with each other? To what extent do they contradict each other in how they approach the past and present, past, present, and future relations? And relatedly, can you say more about how you understand resilience? Is it a sort of can it also be an individual bodily comportment closer to elasticity, connoting the ability to physically and psychically spring back from adversity? Or is it more obdurate, signifying a type of kind of standing in place, whether in the sense of dwelling on the past or withstanding or weathering the present moment? Is resilience a practice that is learned and actively exercised, or is it a disposition easily summoned up from within? And ultimately, this takes me to my final question for Leila. Is resilience also a type of public feeling or affect? And if so, how does it relate to or differ from other affects we associate with the neoliberal moment, say Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism or Mark Fisher's capitalist realism? To continue with this theme of affect that runs across all 4 papers, each paper really shows really well the kind of the sentiments and feelings and emotions associated with the nation, opening up really important questions about attachment and belonging. Ernesto's paper, for instance, destabilizes the meaning of patriotism, pushing beyond the singular, territorially fixed understanding of patria, showing how instead how overlapping and sometimes contradictory attachments to metropole and colony and to different homelands can coexist. The 3 bureaucrats at the center of the paper embody these different attachments, which are in turn mediated and interrupted by their constant moves, sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced, as Ernesto says, between different homes, lands, and provinces. Patriotism in this paper is much more than political duty and responsibility. It brings together different modes of attachment and investment in economic, affective, and psychic senses of the term. So in that sense, the various geopolitical, engineering, extractive, and agricultural projects that are undertaken by these figures can also be thought of as sort of the infrastructures of feeling that construct, sustain, and maybe even derail patriotism. So I would love to hear more about kind of if this might be a helpful category to think through here. And I was also particularly fascinated in your paper, in Ernesto's paper, by Florida Blanca's description of his own work as launching, quote, a joyous revolution in the trade of Spain and the Indies. The sense of euphoria, as Ernesto points out, combines love and gratitude for Patria and for the monarch. And he writes that this is a joyous revolution that demands patriotic efforts at all levels of imperial bureaucracy. But I also wanted to ask about joy that might take as its object, not just patria and imperial grandeur, but bureaucracy itself. So of course, we don't associate joy with bureaucratic paperwork and rituals, but is it also possible to think about bureaucracy too, not as this cold, objective, disinterested machinery, but rather something with its own set of affective registers, intimacies and attachments. And so maybe the joyous revolution dreamed up by these bureaucrats don't just demand patriotic efforts that are expressed through the performance of certain sort of mundane duties and tasks and responsibilities. Maybe they require bureaucratic practices themselves that are felt and sensed in certain ways, whether joyfully or maybe even in a deplorable state of misery. And to return to the theme of temporality, how can we think about these practices that don't just attempt to calculate and master the past, but also entail dreaming up new futures, aspirations, and expectations? What is bureaucratic joy, intimacy, desire, and misery, in addition to patriotic desire, joy, intimacy, and misery? And how does it figure into the shattered dreams of making Santa Marta not the periphery, but the very center of empire? And what is the material that sustains those dreams? Not just engineering projects, the mineral, etc., but by the sort of the very bureaucratic documents, the paperwork, the maps, the correspondence, the report you showed us, the CVs. How do they mediate our understanding of different ways of feeling belonging to empire and or the nation? And if differently, how so? Which brings me to the last shared theme of the panel of materiality, which is at the forefront again in Irina's paper, which insightfully differentiates between objects and things vis-a-vis what is being picked up, packed up, and left behind in the moment of dispersal. And here I want to ask about different meanings of material beyond the objects and that appear in the exhibit to the realm of class. So you note in the paper that there have been different class waves of migration from out of Venezuela since the early 2000s. And you also say that while Lopez's exhibit cannot be seen as a kind of a universal exemplar, but you also don't see it simply merely as a representation of the middle-class Venezuelan experience of migration and exile. But I wonder to what extent the exhibit actually captures ultimately a classed subject of migration. It seems to me that the moment of plastic wrapping can also be a bit of a privilege. It assumes that the path of flight is relatively open, even with the difficulties and urgency of displacement. There's still room for thought and care to go into the departure and that phase of preparation. And even the hope that you describe of return to an abandoned house ultimately rests on the notion of ownership and possession that might not be available to all. Here I'm thinking of Aisha Parla's work on precarious hope, which is about Bulgarian migrants in Turkey, whose hopes of eventual citizenship are sort of differentially produced and distributed given unequal structures of possibility. So to what extent is the plastic wrap around the objects, which again is a kind of a proprietary account of migration, or even the juxtaposition of the blonde bust of Bolivar with the trash can, which I love that imagery. But to what extent is that an equalizer of objects and experiences and class positions? And how can we think about the material without getting too close to fetish? And how can we talk more broadly about national affects, material underpinnings, through the varied resources, opportunities, political and economic constraints and openings that make them possible and are unevenly distributed. Last but not least, I think this dual approach to material, bringing in both the objects and sort of class or political economic analysis of the nation, is something Mara's paper very nicely captures and balances. On the one hand, we have the flags and the pamphlets and the newspapers, the films, the various educational events and paraphernalia that together constitute the different symbolisms and rhetorics of the nation in both its liberal and communist valences across different eras in China. And on this front, I wanted to hear more about how this material relates to the revolutionary affects and communities appealing, so beautifully described by Ernesto, Irina, and Leila in their respective papers. Is there a way to move beyond the top-down production, dissemination, and circulation of these different modalities of patriotism that you described and capture their reception, experience, and feeling on the ground? And I know that can be tricky. And in terms of the other meaning of material, Mara does a wonderful job showing the various redrawing of boundaries entailed in the different articulations of the nation and the people, moving from internal divisions in terms of ethnicities towards different classes, and then ultimately the very undoing of the nation's external boundaries under a more kind of internationalist conceptions of a revolutionary subjecthood under Mao. But I got the sense that the papers at times sounds like it's committed to these very boundaries in ways that might end up reproducing the types of sort of strict divisions that are so problematic about nations themselves in the first place, right? So what does it mean to pose as a problem, as you do, the inclusion of, quote, comrades from capitalist countries in the revolution of China to fight against the people of China, to fight alongside the people of China, excuse me, while Chinese citizens from the wrong class backgrounds are excluded? What does such a vision of the people that embraces such strict boundaries between nations risk foreclosing in terms of political, material, and affective possibilities? And I'll ask one last question, knowing very well that it's probably really annoying for a historian. But what if you were to scramble the strict kind of chronology and periodization that the paper follows and adopt more of that palimpsest-like temporality that we started out with, that these different versions of the nation themselves seem to have kind of entailed across the different periods you're writing about? Because the linear ends up, this came across less in your presentation and more in the paper, but the linear narrative makes it sound a bit as though you're presenting kind of a tragic tale of decline from a version of liberal ethno-nationalism towards a type of revolutionary internationalist patriotism. And in the presentation, I got the sense that you're not wedded to that kind of narrative of decline.
Oh, actually, I am.
Oh, you okay, so maybe I would like to hear more of the elaboration of that in the period. All right, great. Yeah, all right. Talking a lot, so my thought is to open up the discussion to a conversation, if the speakers would like to fold their responses to me into their responses to the audience. We have a modern conversation.
Follow up on the questions you asked. Well, thank you all for the great talk. I found all the talks fascinating, and I was just writing a ton of notes about this, and I'm trying to sort of get all my sort of thoughts together to ask sort of set of questions and group them together. And I guess one of the things that I was sort of noting, and this is, there'll be questions, I promise, but it's more of a provocation to each of you. And it has to do with, I've noticed that, it's within the language that we're talking about, there was this problematic of nation versus state that we're discussing. And I know why you guys are all talking about it, because we are speaking in English, in a language and a political, economic, in a nation that is embedded within context where the sort of hegemonic ideas to think about nationalism is in the sort of division of nation and state, which has its own liberal embedded tradition. Yet many of you are talking about countries that are either post-Second World or in periods that it's in the Second World or are transitioning to the Second World. And one of the things that sort of I want to provoke you guys is, how do you think about, these people in the Second World using the ways that they thought, the ways that they theorized about these things? And here, I guess, saying Second World is to 20th century in some ways, because I'm thinking about the Marxian tradition that has its roots in a sort of older 18th century political economy, intellectual tradition, that how they think about these questions of nation and states is not always in this binary, right? I mean, in some ways you could sort of think of nation as like the effective process of a bureaucratization, right? So they're embedded there. And it's in the three languages of the countries that you guys all sort of talked about, right? I mean, I don't know about the Chinese part, I could be wrong about there, but you have Rodina, Patria, Wo. They all have this sort of element where it's not simple to think about, like, are we talking about homeland? Is it an effective thing? Are we talking about a country, as in like a state? It can be sort of used in ways that Mara sort of discussed about in both Russian, Spanish, and Chinese. But there's also Narod, Pueblo, and is it Shen, or like the people in Chinese?
Oh, it's
You mentioned.
so actually, when we translate people, it's actually several words.
It's a several words, but I mean,
Not period.
it depends on this is the point that I'm using the sort of languages is to show how in English there's no direct translation, and I don't think it's a linguistic issue in the sense of like from a strict, it's a political issue. It's because English, these debates have not been waged on that. And so that's the sort of setting for my questions, that it's like, well, can you take this sort of other, how do you think about this other intellectual tradition and bringing it into thinking about it to move beyond or erode this problematic of nation versus state that, well, to put myself out there, I think is completely erroneous and does not work. So now for direct questions. One of the things, so for Mara, it's basically that I would like to hear you talk more about how, for example, Mao, and not just Mao, but I'll use him as emblematic of the sort of Chinese state, is using this sort of historical arguments. But I mean, they really did dive into this way. And in some ways, it is a powerful sociological theory of thinking about beyond sort of nation and state. And so, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I sort of read that you were sort of reading it while sort of through this nation versus state problematic, rather than sort of challenging that. That's how you're thinking about your project. For Leila, I was thinking about, a lot of these notions of resilience, right, that come out of crisis. I found them very interesting because also coming from Cuba, you hear a lot of these sort of things. People are always saying that, and specifically in the, it was Sonia quote, in the last Sonia quote, that there's this sort of, she's saying, oh, there's like this long historical process, and then why do we need to talk about history? And that's something, and so I was thinking about, have you thought about your sort of Russian subjects, but in a sort of broader context, like these sort of effective notions of myth makings of resilience, is it tied to sort of countries that, to be very broad and polemical about it, it's like there's countries that are very conscious about their history because of their sort of public discourse, how that's developed, the public discourse has developed, versus a place like the US that only now are they sort of beginning to remember that they have a history. Canada applies there. Most of NATO land applies under that rubric. And then, Irina, I also, I was wondering, because I found the project Crisálida. I found it very interesting from a different angle, because there's another anthropologist, the Cuban one, and I wrote down her name, and I can't find her now, Maria Cabrera Ruz, that has done something very similar with the materiality of objects, but of the Cuban socialist period, because it captures a lot of these notions. And you mentioned that, you know, there's a responsibility for taking on the politics of to the materialities of people's life. I can't even read my own handwriting, I'm sorry. But and so I was wondering, you know, there is also a politics to that sort of migration, right? And it's very heated now with Venezuela. A lot of these things are tied, you know, it's the communists that are making me migrate and stuff like that. But then, you know, what does it do to this very sort of act of transparency that you're looking at? It's not exactly through the bubble wrap, but it's still sort of highlighting the materiality of objects that are lost due to changes in political economy that are beyond an individual's capacity. And finally, Ernesto, you know, let's see. I think I would tie it back to the sort of initial thing and, you know, ask you to sort of comment about how this patria is tied to the political economy process, and that, you know, it is kind of strange, but it, you know, would you agree with the statement that a lot of this patriotic sentiment is tied to the state? It's a sort of effective attachment to a state formation process, and that we see this, you know, because this is a moment where things that would later on, like in the 19th century, we would say like the public treasury is being articulated as the real treasury. So could you comment a little bit about how do you see that transition from at least discursively, and how people effectively would look into, say, things like the royal treasury once it becomes the public treasury in a sort of national period after this? Thank you. I hope that was coherent.
Actually, maybe we'll take one more question. Yeah, just for the sake of that.
So yeah, thank you to all the panelists. It was very evocative and really interesting to listen to. I have two questions, if that's okay. One's short and one's a bit longer for Irina. I'm thinking about how this performance that you spoke about kind of mandates this sort of like a notion of a mandatory performance of displacement, you know, with like the embodied acts of wrapping items, but then also bearing in mind that not everyone has the privilege to kind of like wrap the items, like wrap up their stuff before they go, you know, like you spoke about the precarity of certain Venezuelan migrants, and which is totally valid, but I'm thinking about kind of this idea of like the mandatory performance of displacement, whether or not you're in a privileged position, that you have a lot of items to wrap, or you know, you just have your backpack. So yeah, like if you could speak on that, or like what you think about kind of these embodied acts of wrapping up materials. Yeah, so there's that. And then I thought that the work of Pepe Lopez evoked this sort of interaction between like translucency, but also opaqueness. You know, the plastic adds this sort of privacy to both like the external and internal interaction of the items. And then, you know, there's like Pepe in this like enclosed space, like the museum. So I'm thinking about how do you think we can think about the plastic as a kind of protective curtain that maybe maintains notions of care, but also kind of offers isolation, but isolation is sort of like meditative. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Oh, okay, I can go. So I'm gonna try to be very quick because I know there's a lot of us and many questions. So I'm gonna start with Begüm. So your first question about whether this is something about the diaspora or is something that is in every nation. I think it's something obviously in every nation, but I think it's interesting that we rarely think about moments where things are happening, but the outcome is not entirely clear. Because I think there's a certain insistence in the national narrative that there is a before and then there's also a result. And that's also part of the urgency of the moments, right? Like when you're in a crisis, you don't really have the privilege to linger into what might be happening, but you want like a solution or a way out. So I think in a way, this sort of temporality does emphasize what I would think is hidden moments in the dominant narrative in which you're forced to stay with whatever it is. And I think Chrysalis in that sense represents that, something alive that is changing, but you don't get access yet to what is going to happen and what that means when you linger with that. But I completely agree that it's not something exclusive. However, it is something that in the operations that I read in the book, it's something that the way it operates is also very much tied to questions about the Venezuelan diaspora. So how oil and plastic work in terms of the crisis of these concepts in relation to national identity, but also, and this is seen in the other works, like the sort of gaze that doesn't quite manages to focus on specific national symbols because of the state of ruin and collapse that you can see many of associated to many of this. So I think it's both, it's connected to both, but it's also related to that. The question about class, which connects to the one that Valesca also asked, absolutely. We can't look at all these objects and pretend that you don't need to be very privileged, not only to have them, but also to have the time to wrap them. Completely agree. However, I do think that I do believe there's a certain universality to the act of leaving your home, always leaving something behind. That something doesn't have to be any of these things. It can be absolutely anything. It can be trash, or it can be a shoe, or it can be a paper. But I think that everybody that moves necessarily takes something with them, be it something as maybe insignificant as a backpack, and leave something behind. And what I think Lopez is doing is not necessarily focusing on the objects themselves, but precisely on the process of mourning and care that he is able to put there. And that I think it's part of the pain of leaving home, the fact that you will not be able to do that. So I think that what he's doing, and I think he does avoid maybe a little bit, but maybe not, the fetishism that you mentioned, by not putting the objects raw, but by involving them in this wrapping that both gives you access the way you're talking about and limits that access, but we can debate that. But I do think that what he's capturing is a feeling, the feeling of loss, which I think is very hard to capture when you're like, what it means when you leave home or when you move house, and what it means when you didn't get to say goodbye to that life. And I think, so I don't think he's equalizing this to all the situations, but equalizing the feeling of loss that rarely gets captured when your emphasis goes into the migrant as whoever arrived, or the migrant as whoever is not there. In terms of politics, I do believe that there is, to tie it to Valesca as well, I think engage a bit with the question of not so much opaqueness, but opacity by Discussant. And I do think it's very much present, but I think it's important to think about this translucency in relation to the polarization and the insistence on national identity and identification that has been the case in Venezuela in the past years, where you have to identify with a specific group in order to be recognized. So I think there is a politics in creating a sort of blurry gaze where you are forced to reconsider what it means that you're looking at and how you need to be seen. And in that is very much tied to the opacity that I think Valesca mentioned, because it both prevents the reduction of the otherness to a level of hyperlegibility where you get absorbed and turned, as Lopez predicts, into an object, but it doesn't become so opaque that there is no room for a certain relationality and a certain recognition that is something that has been lost in Venezuela, I think, in the past 20 years. So I think that's where the politics lies. And I think I got it.
Me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks, Begüm. So many very deep questions that I won't be able to answer fully. I'll try and tackle a couple of them. Thanks also to your questions. Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Marcos.
Marcos, great. So, yeah, Begüm's question about how well the concepts in the resilience literature fits the reality from my analysis. I think one thing that's interesting that comes out as a kind of defense of discourses of resilience and their use is some historical evidence that resilience discourse, the presence of a resilience discourse in politics is kind of self-fulfilling. So people can actually derive strength, psychological strength, from a narrative that they are part of a people that went through something and managed to get through it. And in that case, in that sense, it kind of helps them. which I think is really interesting and does apply to some of the cases that I encountered. But I think what's missing is that angle, or those cases of resilience fatigue, and that the questions about, well, who is the resilience against, that kind of start to kind of create problems when people are reflecting and when people have grievances, political grievances. So I think that fatigue is missing maybe from those discussions. Let me see what to go for next. Whether the myth contradict or complement, I think that's a really interesting question. I think they actually can complement in the Russian case, even though I presented them as being completely separate, either or. I think they can complement in the sense that there's a real withdrawal in Russia from engagement with politics, and people feel that it's more comfortable and it's safer to withdraw into that kind of personal resilience, which means it can be resilience against everything. It can be resilience against state repression and resilience against external enemies that are going to cause more problems for you on the personal level. And so I think that withdrawal that we're seeing as a result of repression is, it means that the two can complement. Briefly on the question of other ways of thinking that are not nation versus state, that are very much present, of course, in these contexts. I hope in my work to try and disrupt some of that assumption that we understand what a nation is and it applies in every case. We understand the relationship between nation and state, and also to kind of question whether it's so straightforward in the American case or in European cases, or whether it's static. Actually ideas about what the nation is are also shifting in many places. But yeah, languages that don't have an equivalent really to nation, which Russian doesn't, I think make it more interesting to try and explore some of those concepts, some of those notions that we fit under the term nation, like people, like homeland. Yeah, absolutely. And whether resilience discourse is particularly important for countries where history is very important. Yes, of course, yes, because again, relating to this victimhood, nationalism, it's about reinterpreting the past and using elements of memory as critical to national identity. But it's also emerging in new forms. For example, in response to the climate crisis, it's been used in Japanese politics. Following the tsunami of 2011, there was a lot of discourse that they introduced a new policy of increasing national resilience in Japanese culture, with the idea that this is going to happen again. We're going to have more environmental crises that we're going to have to go through, and we should be a nation that can, and we've shown that we can once, so let's carry on. So it can be quite forward looking as well as historical. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so me. Okay, so I think the questions from Begüm and Marco, are actually related. I start from the reception and affection, that part from Begüm. I think for this project, my biggest concern is that I'm looking too much on discourse, and even though I try very hard to see how this notion materializes in all sorts of different media, in history, etc. But first, for people who are already dead, it's very difficult to see whether they bought into that, right? And for the contemporary period, originally I planned actually with your colleague Jessica Chen-Wise, we were in a group, we applied to fund, we designed some survey. There were questions that are on my projects in the survey. That was 4 years ago. And since we started that project, then there was a intelligence law that was passed in China. So we were told that, yes, after we collect data, you need to fly in because we are no longer allowed to transmit the data out. And then the COVID, etc. Now we still haven't got the results 4 years later. You can imagine how, and then at that point, I think in 2018, 19, we were thinking about buying data of those social media from social media companies. At that point, it was possible, and later it became not possible. And then I also originally planned, I even made some contact with my old high school teachers and high school teachers. Now they are teaching at different high schools to see what I can do this anthropological field work that I live with students for 2 months, etc. Basically, almost to be part of them and to have this casual conversation about how they understand that difference or connection between the nation, state, and people, and all those. And then nobody welcomed me because it's just too sensitive. Right. And at this stage, the best I can do is to analyze the latest version of textbook, but it's still what they want to do because it's just impossible. And even with all the social media, etc., because all those, if they disagree, this post will disappear very quickly. So actually, just nobody knows what's going on and how many people, accept this narrative or not. I guess it's kind of related to Marco's question as well, that theoretically speaking, conceptually speaking, I would love to, challenge the concept that, yes, of course, in the English, nation states are different, but for Chinese, probably, and then we have a beautiful intellectual gymnastic, this, I'm not saying it's an intellectual game, it's almost like, it's something I want to do, but in this sort of context, you can imagine the state and the people. The state really want the people to believe that the nation state are the same. But if they truly believe it was the same, the censorship would not operate like that. There are American politicians out there. I may or may not agree with what they say. They say the Chinese government is afraid of the Chinese people. The thing they are afraid the most is the Chinese people. Maybe it's not, but what they are doing says otherwise, right? They don't allow people to say any opinions that they think might be dangerous. So there are a lot of things that have political implications. What I try to do here is actually exactly what you're talking about, that I try to demonstrate this sort of, I have a chart but I had to select over about this translation issue, that for nation, there are two Chinese words, either the Minzu, that means the ethno nation, or the Guojia, that was more the state part of the nation, right? The nation as a whole, more political side. But for Guojia, it could be translated as nation or state, depending on the concept, right? And for the state, it also has, it's not 1-to-1, it's more like 1-to-2, but each Chinese has two counterparts of English. Each English has two counterparts in Chinese. There is a chart. I think a lot of misunderstanding is due to this terminological catastrophe. And I'm not saying I can fix it, but at least the chart is, I hope I can show that. But what I try to show theoretically is exactly for the Chinese language users, it's very difficult for them to distinguish between the nation and the state. And the nation actually doesn't probably in everyday use, doesn't mean that people as we understand the nation is, or the community, right? But we shouldn't allow the Chinese communists to play this game because they are projecting the image that they are just another nation that believe that the state is in service of the nation, right? While the domestic propaganda is different. So we truly need to honor their understanding. For example, if you check the Chinese Foreign Ministry Sino-American relations, or the relationship between China and the United States, is that it starts from 1970s. If we truly honor them, we need to distinguish People's Republic of China from the transdynastic notion, and that was China and the Chinese people. That's to truly honor them, right? Or we either honor them, their logic, or we say like, oh, everybody is playing the game that is the state in service of the nation. Or we honor their understanding to tell everybody that that's their understanding, we honor them, right? What they are trying to do now is project the image as a nation, right? And for the speaker of the foreign ministry say like, Chinese people are their iron wall, right? That means they are using this nation in defense of the regime. But the current system of international law, or our assumption that this is a family of nations, basically allow us to obviously, China does this, China does that. What do you mean by China here, right? Could we say North Korea does this? That means North Korean people want that, right? Conceptually, we also need to distinguish. It's just I haven't figured it out completely, but I guess it's just like almost like that's why I think Ernesto's work really inspired me that, you know, we have a limited early modern globalization. We also have a limited effect of globalization. Just in the West, I don't think people really understand the limitation of the so-called family of nations. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes left, so I'm almost
So
interrupting you. So
But I can be very
yes,
brief.
so we'll keep both to the questions and the responses, sure. Okay,
Yeah,
yes.
very briefly, so because I think I connect Marco's question and Begüm's comments on the issue of thinking of patria and the connections with visions of prosperity, economic development, political economy, right? And I so actually lots of what I have been doing for this project is analyzing the different approaches to turning a miserable province into a wealthy province, producing royal revenue, right? Sometimes also framed as public good, right? And you're right in terms of okay, what's public good, public good in the late 18th century Spanish world versus public good in the 19th century early national period in Latin America in terms of who's supposed to be the beneficiary of that revenue that it's expressed as public good. But in terms of the connection, this is helping me think about patriotism in the context of the joyous revolution, right? As thinking of a transition as a transition in that patriotism, in the impetus perhaps that for that patriotism, as thinking of a moment of a stage of patriotism despite deplorable economic conditions towards understanding the joyous revolution as creating a possible potential future of patriotism because of the transformations, the transformations that were just achieved, right? Which actually I was also thinking about it with Leila's paper, right? Because to demand always resilience, it's like, yeah, you have to be patriotic despite everything, right? And which is completely different as being patriotic because which could be an American patriotism, right? Or patriotism because we're the best, we're number one, USA, right? So it's interesting to me now to think about the role of economics of the economy and agricultural development and so on and so forth in helping us think of stages of patriotism and reasons for that patriotism.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed all the presentations and Begüm's comments. I wanted to focus my questions on Leila's paper, and then I had a shorter question for Irina. There's so much I liked about this project. I appreciated the distinction between the external threat versus the internal repression as things for which resilience is necessary. But I also agree with Begüm that you could have other alternatives to that dichotomy. And I wanted to suggest one that I experienced and then one that comes out of your material. I was a student in Moscow in 1979 and was riding in a taxi cab where the driver had a portrait of Stalin hanging from the rearview mirror. And so even though my Russian was not very good, I decided to try asking him why, basically. And I said, didn't you have any relatives who perished in the camps or were arrested and sent to the camps? And he said, no, but we lost a lot of people at the front. And that's, as you know, a very common kind of conflation that Russians do. Stalin gets off the hook for his internal repression because he's considered responsible for the external defense, right? So it's a blurring of the two. But what I thought was really interesting in your interviews is that you sometimes didn't really get either one or the other. You got a kind of commonsensical response in the Gramscian sense. People said, yes, we're resilient to mosquitoes and we hoard potatoes because they might run out. And so that was really striking for me. And the other question I had was about neoliberalism, because I liked, again, the way you framed that as a way in our contemporary discourse of making individuals responsible, letting the state off the hook for the state of the collectivity. But in a way, it's anachronistic, because what you describe as resilience goes way back in Russian history, right? So how do you link it then in the broader project? And one thing that occurred to me is maybe it won't come from the bottom up evidence, but it would come from what the Russian government and state are trying to do by linking resilience to neoliberalism. I'm wondering if you're finding that in your work. And finally, just a question about your own role and your method. I hope there aren't any anthropologists I would insult here, but if you were an anthropologist, you would spend most of your paper talking about your positionality vis-a-vis your interlocutors, right? But you don't. And so I wonder if you had, many more resources, would there have been a benefit to have local people doing these interviews, and especially matching Russians with Russians and Tatars with Tatars to elicit whether there is a difference in the sense of Russian nationality for people who are ethnically not Russian or mixed, in the Russian sense of nationality. Yeah, that was it. And then just for Irina, I was absolutely fascinated by your project and your presentation. I thought I heard you say, and I think in your comments to Begüm you did too, that Visalia can be indeterminate in what it produces.
Mhm.
And when I think of a chrysalis, I think, well, it's going to be a butterfly or a moth of some kind.
Mhm.
And what it seemed to me Lopez was doing is saying, well, look inside. It's a little bit opaque, but you can see that it's not necessarily a butterfly or a moth. It could be almost anything. It could be Bolivar, or it could be a trash can. And that really shakes up that what a country, what a government, what a state is trying to do in shaping a determinate nationality. What we're all going to be Venezuelans, right? No, we're actually very different, and especially if we have to flee our country, we could be very different. So I think it's a less sophisticated take than yours, but I just wondered what you think of it. Thank you.
One more question before there are any?
Thanks so much. Yeah, fantastic, really helpful comments, and a couple of things I just wanted to briefly respond to, and others that I'll take away to think about more. So the reference to neoliberalism and whether it's something that's difficult that wouldn't be found in the bottom-up narratives. Actually, there were a couple of examples where it was found, and that was what made me think that link maybe was quite relevant after all, in spite of the fact that there's a deeper history that comes from, before that. And that was one example that I was going to put up, but there wasn't enough time to include another one, was one respondent who said, actually, it is a national trait, but it's a post-Soviet national trait, because we don't depend on the welfare state. We didn't grow up with that assumption that the state was going to be there for us, and we're a people who are, the new generation is a people that is really strong and able to defend, fend for themselves. So yeah, almost positioning it as a new trait in spite of the history, which I thought was quite interesting. But there's definitely the top-down side that I need to look at more as well. Yeah. And then in terms of my positionality and how it would have gone if Russians had done the interviewing, I'm not sure that I would have got much from doing that, because of the sensitivity of the questions. Even then, now I don't think I'd be able to do the interviews, but even then it was pretty sensitive. And at the same time, I almost felt like I had an access that maybe local people wouldn't, because they felt that, that a lot of people didn't want to talk to me. I didn't always find it easy to find interviewees, but the people who did want to talk to me often felt that it was a safe space. Because I was an outsider and I wasn't going to go around, I didn't have an incentive to tell anyone else in the society about what they'd told me, or to have a kind of political judgment on it. So often people would say to me, I don't talk about this. This is what I think, but I don't talk about it to anyone. So I think certainly those narratives where people said that a Russian would have probably struggled, or a local person would have struggled to get. Tatars, interviewing Tatars might have been different, but even then, unless it was somebody they knew, they wouldn't necessarily trust that that person had the same political position as them. Whereas there were a lot of assumptions about me as a Westerner that maybe people could be critical in front of me and it was okay. Not everybody was critical. I also had the people who were quite defensive, and saw it as an opportunity to show their national pride and repeat their official messaging. So a mix, but yeah, it would certainly have been different if a Russian did it. I don't know if it would have generated more. Yeah.
I think maybe getting at, you said you mostly got people with post-secondary education and others wouldn't. Yeah, I don't know. But no, I think that you probably did get things that local people would not have got. That sounds right to me. Thank you.
Okay, no, I love that reading. Thank you for sharing it. I think that the beauty of that translucency to me is that it doesn't really push us towards the outcome immediately, but rather, in fact, it doesn't push us to the outcome at all. Like, we don't know what happens with, I know what happened to the but we will never get access to the final result. But what I do like, and what you pointed out, I think very nicely, is that because we get a feeling or a sense of what might be in it, I feel like not just lingering with that, but lingering with the fact that the outcome can also be that it's completely destroyed and that nothing will come out of it. That's what I mean in terms of that potentiality that only appears when the objects are like this, like not traveling and not at a home, but in this in-between space where that gets activated. So thank you.
Thank you.
We are at time. Thank you for coming in. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.